Thanks, Bob. I'm actually from the Isaacs lab, so I work mostly on blueberries and raspberries. But most of my research of late has been focused on basic biology and behavior of spotted-winged Drosophila. So that brings us to what they're doing in the winter and what sort of behavior they're providing us with in the winter. And so, of course, that means a little scarf and a hat. But in reality, what we see and what all of you are pretty familiar with is we start to catch spotted-winged Drosophila in late June or early July, and then we see a huge population increase, as you can see here. And so this is all of the years that we've had spotted-winged Drosophila so far. This is in blueberry, but we see the same thing in all of these other crops, where we have this rampant population increase, and then in October, November, December, we start to catch fewer and fewer, and then they disappear. So Larry alluded to this earlier, but basically we have this time period where we're not catching any flies. We don't know where they are, what they're doing, etc. So my research has really tried to focus on basically what we can figure out with where they are. And what we have learned recently is that spotted-winged Drosophila have what we call a winter morph. And so this happens when the eggs or the early larval instars are subjected to cold temperatures. So cold can be like 50 degrees or below. And so what you start to see is these flies that are the same species, but they look darker. They have a smaller body, and then they also have these longer wings. So you can see, especially here on the males, that they have those longer wings. So they have those phenotypic changes. They also have a lot of metabolic changes that we're aware of from some other studies. So they have an increased ability to withstand cold temperatures. And then they also have reduced egg production, DNA replication, and cell division. So basically their metabolism is slowing down. They're gearing up to go through the winter. So the lethal temperature for 50% of the population of summer morphs is around -1 degree Celsius. For the winter morphs, we still don't really know. There's some early findings, but we're still kind of unaware of what they're able to withstand and for how long they're able to withstand it for. But we do know they have that increased cold tolerance. So I'm going to go over the seasonal phenology. So when do we actually see these winter morphs in Michigan? And then look at the reproductive capacity of these winter morphs compared to summer morphs. And then to look at survival rates of when we put these lab-reared winter morphs out into the field in the winter, how well do they survive and how long do they survive for? So again, going over that seasonal phenology. For this one, I'm just going to go over the methods very quickly, but for this one what we did is trap flies from June to December for as long as we could. We would take those individual female flies and cut off their right wing, and then we'd mount their right wing on a slide, and then that would give us the ability to take a picture of it and then use that picture, use computer software, and measure that wing. So this is giving us this metric of wing length throughout time. And so you can see here, this black bar is showing you wing length throughout time. And so June through September, we see statistically similar wing length. So this means that we're catching those shorter wing lengths, those summer morphs. That makes sense. As you get into October, you start to catch longer wings and into December. What's interesting to notice here also is that there's a gradient. So there isn't some sudden shift up to winter morphs. There does appear to be this intermediate phase. So winter morphs probably isn't a great term. It's more of a deviation from a summer morph. So it's not really its own separate morph, if that makes sense. We can also look at temperature at these sites where we caught these flies and see how that relates. And as we would kind of expect, it's a pretty much perfect match. So as temperature starts to get cooler, that's where we see those longer wings appear. So we know that we're getting those winter morphs starting in October and until December, and then we're not catching flies any longer in our traps. When we were doing this, we also looked at body color just to see if that would be an okay metric for us to use. And indeed, we saw those flies that were medium or dark, that we called medium or dark, had longer wings compared to the light, and that was a statistical difference. Moving on to the mixed objective, and that's looking at reproductive capacity. So here we're trying to compare summer morphs and winter morphs, and how many eggs can they lay. So for this, we took lab-reared summer morphs and lab-reared winter morphs. We're also wanting to understand if winter morphs were subjected to warmer temperatures, could they lay more eggs than if they're left in cold temperatures? So we had acclimated winter morphs and then unacclimated winter morphs. So for each of these flies, we put them in petri dishes with diet, and that would allow them to lay eggs at several different temperatures. We had 10 degrees, 15 degrees, and 25 degrees Celsius. We left them there for 24 hours, and then we were able to come back and count the number of eggs that the flies were laying. So here you have the average number of eggs laid per fly, and then that light color here is the summer morph. So you can see across all of these temperatures, summer morphs are laying more eggs than the winter morphs. Then looking at the acclimated winter morphs, those that are subjected to warmer temperatures for 2 days before, they can lay more eggs at each of these temperatures than the unacclimated winter morphs. So this is just 2 days in warm spring-like conditions, and they're able to all of a sudden ramp up the reproductive capacity. So this is giving you a good idea that in the spring, this is probably what they're doing. They don't require much time at these warmer conditions before they can actually ramp up that reproductive ability. So this isn't something that we think is a true diapause. It's not something that is probably staying in these winter conditions for very long. So if these temperatures change or environmental conditions change, it's likely that that fly is responding very quickly to those changes. And then moving on to the last study. So here we took, again, lab-reared winter morphs. And for this, we basically went out and dug holes in the ground. We put 100 flies in little containers. We cover that with leaf litter, and then we would take them out at bi-weekly intervals, and we'd look at their survival and temperature. And so when we take them out, we put them in warmer conditions and basically see how many were still alive. So I'm going to show you the temperature data first. So we monitored temperature basically at 3 different areas. We did ambient temperature, and that's that blue line. And then we did surface temperature, so right below that leaf litter, and then buried temperature, so where those flies were located. And then I'm just going to show you what goes below freezing and what doesn't, if we assume that they can't withstand much below freezing, which they probably can. But basically what we're seeing with this ambient temperature is that we know that obviously we have temperatures below freezing. This was done in 2016, so this is when we actually had a pretty mild winter, and this was in Lansing as well. But when we look at the buried temperature and the surface temperature, they hardly dip below freezing, and in fact that buried temperature doesn't go below freezing at all. So we know that this is probably a really good environment for them to hang out in, so they can stay away from that those freezing conditions. When we look at survival, we didn't have much luck with this. So here's % survival, and this is when we put all of our flies out near the end of November. And then by 2 weeks later, we saw around 30% survival. 4 weeks later, around 3% survival, and then the following 2 weeks, we saw very, very low survival, and then didn't catch any flies after that. They were all dead. So this could be for a lot of reasons, partly because these are lab-reared flies, and we have no idea. We're just assuming that they're in these conditions. So we're making a lot of assumptions here, but this is giving us a nice survival curve. And then this is something that we'll be repeating starting actually this week. We'll be out digging a bunch of holes to put flies out in, and we'll also be doing this with cold acclimated summer morphs, and then also the pupal life stage as well. So we're hoping to gain some more information from that. So again, with arrival, we're starting to see those winter morphs come in October and until December. Reproduction-wise, they don't mate or lay many eggs when they're in those cold temperatures, but if they're given warmer temperatures, they will lay more eggs and they will start to become reproductively active. For survival, again, we didn't see survival past 6 weeks, but if flies are underneath this leaf litter or in the soil, they're avoiding these freezing temperatures and this ambient air temperature, so this is probably where they are, which is in the ground. So basically what this brings us to is, why does this matter? Why do we care about where they are in the winter? So there's kind of a disagreement with researchers on what spotted wing Drosophila is actually doing in the winter. Most of us at MSU in our lab group think that there is this bottleneck effect going on in the winter. So what I mean by that is that if there's our fall population, and we know we're absolutely saturated with flies. As we get into the winter, we see a lot of die-off. A lot of flies chose the wrong overwintering place, or they woke up too early, or they just weren't prepared for whatever reason. And so as we progress, we start with a very, very small population in the spring that eventually gives us our largest population in late June and early July, and that's when we start to catch those. The issue with that is that we're not catching winter morphs, we're catching summer morphs in late June and early July. So we have no indication that winter morphs are actually successfully surviving the winter because we cannot catch them in our traps. I personally think, again, that this is because we have that really low survival, but we're still working on trying to understand that a lot better. And Larry also mentioned that project that I'm doing with Danielle and trying to understand what sort of volatiles that are out there that they're responding to, and perhaps differently from those summer morphs. So again, we're working on those survival studies, comparison of attractants between these two morphs, and then trying to extend our trapping into the spring and see if we can actually catch those winter morphs. So there's a lot of people to thank for this. A lot of people worked on this project, and the funding agencies, of course.